Before the French Revolution, we have two conflicting concepts of fashion. We are mostly going to talk about female fashion today, but you will also see that in male fashion later on, after we finish with the female fashion. So two conflicting ideas. One was the idea that clothes should represent one's status in life. They should express wealth and elegance and sophistication. This is especially visible in the clothes worn by the aristocracy, by the French aristocracy, but not only at the royal court. The extreme version would be the panier dresses. The panier dresses are those huge dresses that are very flat. They are very flat from the front, so you needed to go through the doors sideways. The idea was to create a kind of display at the front of the skirt, a display for decorations, for elaborate embroidery, sometimes made in precious materials like gold and silver, for expensive handmade lace, or at least a lot of draperies and flounces. These dresses, you can sometimes see them on fashion plates, you can see them a lot on the portraits of the aristocracy of that period. First of all, Marie Antoinette, Queen Marie Antoinette. They were worn with wigs, both by men and women, with feather headdresses, with high heels, both by men and women, with the makeup, the face powder and the rouge. So they were very far from the natural form, from the natural look as possible, because the idea was to express the wealth and the domination of human mind over nature. The other conflicting idea was the idea started by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is sometimes called the father of Romanticism, but he was, of course, before the period of Romanticism. But what he propagated in his works was the idea of return to nature. He believed that nature was perfect and only humans messed up with it and made it worse. So the idea of the return to nature, this was very far from the court. This was more connected with, let's say, the residences of country gentlemen and ladies, of the gentry, rather than the aristocracy, who spent a lot of their time in court. Rousseau spent some time in England as a guest, and his ideas were very well liked by the English nobility. So sometimes you have quite a visible contrast between the French more formal dresses and the English dresses in this natural style. The style was sometimes called sentimentalism. They used a lot of natural decorations, like flowers or straw hats, or at least flower motifs for decoration. They used natural hair instead of wigs. You still might powder your natural hair, as was the fashion, and it was also a deterrent for insects, for lice. So it was a kind of hygienic thing as well. The same with the wigs, but you wouldn't wear those very bulky dresses. You would wear something more practical. There was a sentimental image of peasant, of country people, the shepherdesses, and this became so popular that even Queen Marie Antoinette in Versailles had like an artificial model village made where she would play with her ladies at being shepherdesses. They would have beautiful sheep that were washed and perfumed and decorated with ribbons, and they would just dress up as those fantasy peasant women and just enjoy themselves. So we have some elements of peasant dress, such as more comfortable shoes, flat shoes, aprons, sashes and ribbons in the waist instead of belts, so something that looks a bit more comfortable and natural. Straw hats, bonnets, caps, so all these things that were popular in the folk costumes. A fichu, you'll have look at the glossary on Moodle. I'll put these words there. A fichu is like a scarf, really, a triangular scarf that you put on your neck and front of the bodice. So the informality was generally associated with the English dress, and then the revolution happened. So these natural, sentimental elements became also politicized. They were associated with the anti-aristocratic movement, so it became patriotic to wear the clothes that would be more related to folk costume than the aristocratic court dress. So the aprons and the fichus and the sashes, they all become very popular. You have the concept of the patriotic dress in the national colors. So in France, of course, it's red, white and blue. You have some elements of fashion like the rosettes, the decorative like ribbon rosettes in the national colors that people wear. More and more people, first men but very quickly women as well, stop wearing wigs. It didn't happen overnight, but as the revolution turned to the reign of terror and wearing anything associated with aristocracy could actually get you guillotined. People stopped wearing wigs, they stopped wearing powder, and all of the elements earlier associated with the aristocracy would go away. Another popular source of inspiration in this period, and this is really the beginning of neoclassical fashion proper, so this natural form, the natural dress that starts before the revolution and becomes really popular during the revolution, is supplemented with the great popularity of the costumes inspired by classical antiquity. So the Greeks and the Romans. First the Greeks and then the Romans. Why? Because the Greek culture was seen as the beginning of European culture in history, and the revolution wanted to create the impression, the kind of symbolic impression, that they were starting the history anew. So going back to the Greeks, of course, was a natural reaction. Also, most people then believed that the ancients wore white clothes. They didn't know that many of the popular Greek and Roman statues were actually painted. The colors did not survive, they were made in white marble, so the white color was also associated with antiquity, and it very nicely corresponded with ideas of youth, of the new beginning, of innocence, So this traditional association of white collar with youth and innocence and virginity, you can see the expression of it in popular wedding dresses even today, but in the neoclassical period this was also associated with the Greeks and the Romans. The Roman fashion start to take over the Greek fashion inspirations when Napoleon declared himself emperor, of course. So we have the movement from the democracy of Greece to the empire of Rome, and of course Napoleon was very much influenced by the Roman Empire. So what we have also, going back to the revolution, costume as a political declaration. It's very visible in men's fashion as well. They start wearing less aristocratic fashions. For example, they start wearing pantaloons and trousers rather than knee breeches. We'll talk about it later on. But the women also start wearing the patriotic jewelry, for example. If you go to museums, you can sometimes find the jewelry from the revolutionary period, including the stones of the Bastille, for example, used as almost precious stones. We have people wearing, let's say, military-inspired clothes. Women as well. Male hats, or hats that look like male hats. Sashes in national colors. Those cockades or ribbon decorations that I mentioned already. Plus the à la paysanne, so the peasant style dresses. In the early 1790s, there is a short-lived fashion called the La Merveilleuse, which means the marvelous, because it was so shocking and so extreme. It's a very joyful fashion of the young people who wanted to explore exaggeration and extremities of the new fashion. So very long skirts that were hiked up when you were walking, so you could actually see the legs. Huge hats, very large shawls, everything was exaggerated. It was a short-lived fashion, and it had a male equivalent as well. But it was there. It was something that was quite ridiculed, especially in England. And here you will see quite a lot of cartoons making fun of fashions. And you have to remember one thing. During the revolution and during the war with France, there was a blockade of the English Channel. So British and French fashions took slightly different routes. The French fashion was more politicized, and it started to adopt the classical elements earlier than the British fashions. The British continued longer with the natural style, with the, let's say, sentimental style. So, for example, you can see the difference in the bonnets. The British bonnets tend to be more elaborate. They use more feathers. You have more emphasis at the back of the skirt, which is like a kind of gathering at the back of the skirt. It's popular everywhere, but I guess slightly more in Britain. The thing that was universally adopted relatively early on, so in the 90s, 1790s, was the elevation of the waistline. So the idea was to create a kind of vertical look in which a woman's figure would look like a column wrapped in a drapery. So the waistline would go very high up, almost to the level of the breast, so just below the bust. So not the natural level for the waist, not the narrowest part, of course, of the waist. So that the skirt would be long and flowing. And it really starts to look like a kind of drapery. It was very often worn with a shawl or a fichu, so the female figure would be like a column with different draperies. In England, you have some exotic elements popular as well. For example, turbans. So another wrapper used as a headdress. Here we have a cartoon by Gilray making fun of a lady putting on her cap or the turban in this case. So one-piece dresses rather than two-piece dresses, so the bodice and the skirt would be combined. The extra fullness at the back, it's quite important, but the main emphasis is really on the bust. So the drapery effect, it starts to change gradually, but it remains relatively stable throughout the period. So the elevated waistline is something very typical for this style. Rather natural hairstyles, sometimes even shorter hairstyles, especially in France. After the Reign of Terror ended, it became a kind of fashionable statement to have shorter hair in women, probably for the first time in a long time, and to actually display short hair, not below the wig. The idea was that all those aristocrats who were imprisoned before they were guillotined usually had their hair cropped short. So those who survived would still have short hair because they were the aristocrats who escaped execution and they were released from prison. So of course, now it wasn't dangerous to pose for an aristocrat, but it became fashionable again to display those shorter hairstyles. Also, it was believed that Greeks, and also to some extent the Romans, but mostly the Greeks, they wore their hair short and decorated in this kind of natural way with very simple decoration like ribbons or bandeaux, so this kind of bands in the hair, or simple bonnets without really too much decoration, perhaps one feather, one or two, not a lot, and the bonnets really become small and simple. First in England, but soon enough in France as well. We have fashionable ladies of this period, so if we look at the portraits of some fashionable ladies of France of this period, you can see them looking almost as if they were going for a fancy dress party. Like they look like they have a replica clothes of the Greek fashions, with the geometric patterns on the shawls and the hairstyles and the dresses that look like ancient draperies, ancient fashions, mostly in white or kind of off-white color. So here we have those ladies. One of the ladies that was really the leader of fashion in this period was Empress Josephine, Napoleon's first wife. She was a very avid collector of something that was a very popular accessory of this period, that is cashmere shawls. The original ones were imported from India and they came from the British Empire. Basically, they were imported by the British tradesmen, and they were made from original cashmere. Some were said to be so delicate that you could actually put them through a wedding ring. The entire big shawl could be just squeezed through a wedding ring. It was so delicate, but they were warm and beautifully decorated. Soon enough, replicas of these shawls were made in Britain, especially in Scotland. There was a town called Paisley which started specializing in these kind of replica Indian shawls with very characteristic kind of leaf or drop pattern, which soon enough started to be called Paisley shawls. So they really start in the first years of the 19th century. So they become very, very popular fashion accessory. Another popular fashion accessory of this period is the handbag, or before that, if you watched the lecture last week, they had separate pockets, like kind of handbags that were tied at the waist. Now with the one-piece dresses, they start carrying handbags, or reticules as they were called then. So kind of bags, sometimes decorative and embroidered, to carry personal belongings. So they become quite popular at this period. So we continue in a moment.